We're going to turn to a report by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz. They spoke to officials in the Israeli military about the thousands of so-called terrorists they claim to have killed in Gaza, and they talked of kill zones or combat zones. These are invisible red lines in and around areas of fighting or Israeli military presence. If anyone who's not from the Israeli military crosses those lines, they get shot or killed. That includes Palestinian civilians, and they're branded as terrorists by Israeli forces, even if they've never held a gun in their lives. So it's not about what the person did, but where he was killed, according to the report. Their only crime, they breached an invisible line drawn by the Israeli army. The revelations came after Al Jazeera obtained a distressing video over a week ago, which showed the moments 4 unarmed Palestinians were killed by an Israeli drone in Khan Yunis. The attack reportedly took place in early February. A senior Israeli officer told Haaretz they were unarmed and didn't pose a danger to their forces in the area. We saw similar scenes last week. Al Jazeera obtained video showing Israeli forces shooting once again at 2 unarmed Palestinians at close range. One of the men repeatedly waved what appears to be a piece of white fabric to show they're not a threat. This is an international symbol of surrender. The bodies of the 2 Palestinians were then buried by an Israeli bulldozer. Let's take this on with Antony Loewenstein. He's the author of the Palestine Laboratory, a book on Israel's arms and surveillance industry. Joins us now live from Sydney. Antony, thanks for joining us here. It's distressing to watch those videos, but these so-called kill zones are a familiar mode of operating for the Israeli army, aren't they?
They are, disturbingly so, because I've been reporting on this issue around Gaza and Palestine for close to 20 years. And if you look at pretty much every major Gaza war between Israel and Hamas since pretty much 2009, you see after those wars, Israeli soldiers speak to often the group Breaking the Silence, which is an Israeli NGO, talking about what they did. And they regularly say that rules of engagement were loose beyond belief, that killing civilians was normal. And this, I think, really doesn't just go to the rules of engagement, but also to the permissive culture within the Israeli military, where over years, so few soldiers ever get prosecuted for any kind of serious crimes. This also applies to the West Bank. So obviously, this current situation is on a scale that we've never seen before in Palestine. But what we're seeing in this Haaretz report, and I've been hearing also from my sources, is a sadly familiar tale.
Yeah, the Israeli argument is that in war, lines are blurred, that you enter these zones and you will get killed. But the point is, people just don't know where the lines are, do they?
They don't. And I mean, this is exactly what the US was saying in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, when the US was killing huge amounts of civilians. And again, these invisible lines that civilians don't know where they are. And Israel has a long track record, long before this current post-October 7 environment, of killing huge amounts of Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the West Bank. And again, this, I think, goes to the heart of why the International Criminal Court and the ICJ are looking very seriously at these kinds of examples, because these kinds of courts can intervene when domestic courts do not or cannot. And it's pretty clear that over years, the Israeli courts have no interest, frankly, in addressing these, and nor do the Israeli political establishment or the media. It's important to note that this kind of culture in Israel, and I spent years living in Palestine, that the culture within Israel, the Israeli media, is not just permissive, but dehumanizes Palestinians. So as we've seen since October 7, huge amounts of Israeli soldiers proudly posting on the internet, TikTok and Instagram, themselves dehumanizing Palestinians, blowing up Palestinian homes. That, I think, is directly connected to these kinds of cases where so many Palestinian civilians, including those who are literally waving white flags, are killed in cold blood.
Are there rules of operation rules of engagement, I should say, in Israeli operations, or are they just open to interpretation by whoever's commanding that patch of land?
Well, the Israeli military, of course, says that there are. In that Haaretz report, they claim that they have very strict rules of engagement. And whenever there is a case, for example, the recent one of the ICJ, Israel says very clearly that their soldiers must abide by certain rules. But what matters really is the reality on the ground. And not just these Israeli soldiers talking to Haaretz in the last day or so, but over years, years and years, you have Israeli soldiers talking about the idea that because they realise that there's no real punishment for killing Palestinians or injuring them, and this is not just in Gaza, but the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and in fact that military culture is one that is led from the top. I mean, you had the Israeli defence minister and indeed many in the Israeli military establishment since October 7 distributing literally leaflets talking about how Israel is going in there to cleanse, their words, Palestinians. I mean, this is the culture that allows that kind of inhumane killing. And it's tragic that over, we're thinking now about what, 35, 40,000 Palestinians killed since October 7. A vast, vast majority of them are not terrorists. They're Palestinian civilians. And yet Israel keeps on claiming that about 9 to 10,000 of those numbers are terrorists, when that figure is clearly massively inflated.
You would think that anybody walking in open land, if they may well be suspects as far as the Israelis are concerned, could just be arrested rather than just blown up.
Well, potentially. I mean, that, of course, would be the logical, humane outcome. But in the cases that Al Jazeera screened in the last couple of weeks, and there have been many others that other media outlets have obtained, we see cases of Palestinian civilians just going to try to retrieve items from their destroyed homes or trying to get food. We've seen the various cases of Israel targeting individuals who are trying to get either food that's been dropped by the Americans or others, or food trucks that are being brought in via Rafah on the Egyptian side. So that would be the logical outcome. But again, there is no accountability for these kinds of killings. And whether it's by drone or quadcopter or simply Israelis opening fire, this is why international attention and international prosecution is so important now. We cannot simply wait and hope that the Israeli military or establishment will investigate this, because history shows they will not.
Right, always widespread condemnation, but nothing ever seems to change. Antony, I just want to bring you back to our story about al-Shifa, the Israelis pulling out, the Israeli army pulling out of the al-Shifa hospital complex, where they have been for 2 weeks, as you know, leaving dreadful destruction behind. It's the second time they've assaulted the area. Targeting hospitals, of course, prohibited under international law, but again, it is the way the Israeli army operates.
And it's important to note that the first time they went in there, the whole coverage was that they were discovering a Hamas command and control center, which was not found at all. The second time in the last weeks, they're claiming that huge amounts of Hamas and Islamic Jihad fighters were in there. I haven't seen much evidence for that, frankly. But again, as you rightly say, it is illegal to essentially bombard, destroy, and attack a hospital where there are thousands and thousands of Palestinian civilians, where the hospitals in Gaza have already been completely destroyed in the last months. And it seems yet again, without international intervention, and the US and Germany, the two biggest arms dealers that are selling weapons and giving weapons to Israel, until that stops, I fear that this war will continue.
Now, Palestinian officials have said that hundreds of Palestinians have been killed in and around al-Shifa over the past a couple of weeks. What would account for that high rate of casualties, do you think?
Or the fact that so many Palestinians are sheltering in the hospitals. I mean, this has been the case since October 7. Although the hospitals have been targeted extensively by the Israelis, many civilians have nowhere else to go because their homes have been destroyed. Let's also not forget it's winter, it's still very cold, and many Palestinians need intense medical care, and hospitals and there's nowhere safe in Gaza, but it's somewhere to go. And after the Israelis pulled out of al-Shifa a few months ago, the hope was, obviously a false hope, that al-Shifa would remain to be a safe place, but clearly it's not. And again, the idea that Israel is not just bombing, but airstriking areas around these hospitals is not just a breach of international law. I mean, I saw this before, Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, routinely saying that their own teams are being targeted. I mean, this is kind of the actions of a rogue state, not of a so-called democracy, which receives huge amounts of support from the Western elites to this day.
Antony, appreciate that. Thanks for your knowledge. Antony Loewenstein speaking to us there from Sydney. Thank you.